Hey, Joe.
How's it going?
Good. Well, good day to everyone, and thank you to Deloitte for presenting this event. As you heard, my name is Silpan Patel. I'll be hosting a Q&A with Joe Lonsdale, the founder of AVC and one of the co-founders of Palantir. Joe, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself and
Sure.
provide a few comments?
It's nice to meet everyone. You know, we started Palantir 17 years ago. I was a computer scientist out of Stanford, and I worked a lot at PayPal with the guys. And you know, the whole background kind of came from a mindset of making sure we protect people's data and information, and in Palantir's case, civil liberties, while making sure we get the bad guys. You know, at PayPal, the Chinese and Russian mafia were our big challenge, and they destroyed 7 of our competitors, and we figured out how to stop them from destroying us while still protecting our customers' data. And it was, you know, very analogous challenge with Palantir. And you know, Palantir is a really entrepreneurial company. There's lots of things within Palantir they've built and they've productized in the defense world. So I've been really lucky to learn a lot about different areas there. But you know, for about a decade, I didn't work in defense as much. We've done a lot of big things in healthcare and logistics and otherwise. In the last few years, a few friends and I realized, gosh, there's a really big gap between the very top talent in Silicon Valley and between the big defense primes. And there's a lot of important work to be done in this area. So we started building some more in defense again, and I'm now spending a lot more time on it again. So excited to talk about it.
Thank you. So so our topic today is going to be dual use investing, building a dual use technology company on the back of venture capital, and investing in artificial intelligence companies that serve commercial and national security customers. So I'll curate the Q&A for you. I'm going to keep an eye open on this, on the live comments. So if you have questions, please put them forward. But let's start. Our first question for you, Joe. What are you building in defense, and why are you excited about it?
So, you know, I think that at this point, it's become really clear that China is a big threat to America. I think that there's a lot of values in the world about where the future is going to be, and there's certain values behind America, and there's certain values behind China that are very separate, and there's an important difference here. And to me, I'm very patriotic. I think Pax Americana, peace through strength, is the right way. So I would like America not to be passed by China and by other countries. I think if we stay stronger, it's better for the world. That's a complicated and big debate, but let's take that debate as given. If you believe that it's better for America to be strong, you should be working in defense. If you do not believe that, you should probably not be working in defense. So anyway, so that aside, given that I feel that, and given that those are my values, I want to make sure the very top technologists are working in defense. It's very clear the last 10 or 20 years, the top technologists have not been going into the defense primes, have not on the margin been working on these problems. The very best ones have been working on other things in Silicon Valley. And a lot of the top Silicon Valley companies have refused to work on defense. And so that's a very strong value a few of my friends and I have, is we need to take the best, we need to convince them to work on these problems. And there are important new things you can achieve with new technology that have not been achieved by others. And so now that we're doing that, already a few things we're building are running circles around the old primes. It's a very, very fun time to be doing it.
And what do you think is the difference between the culture in Silicon Valley and Austin? What are your thoughts between where the opportunities are in Austin when it comes to the defense startup space?
Awesome. Well, you know, I'm actually getting a place in Austin and hope to be building a lot more there as well. So I think you know, there's about 9 companies I'm invested in that have 600 employees in Austin now. So we're seeing a lot of talent start to shift out there. I think it's very exciting to see the Army Futures Command there as well. Sorry about that noise. And it's you know, I think the biggest thing with these companies is, are the technologists in charge? Are the technologists running things there? And so you either have a culture where the business people are telling the technologists, the sales people are telling the technologists what they want, or the technologists are helping frame it. And I think that's the biggest difference between the two.
What have you experienced in terms of the differences in culture in Austin? Is it and working on defense technology activities compared to Silicon Valley?
Well, you know, just in general, I don't know if I can speak to Austin so much as a general way people do things. I think a lot of times you'll have, the question is, are the top technologists, are these the people who were the ones you would have learned the most from in a top 20 school, who everyone looked up to? Are they running the company, or are they in the basement taking orders from the people running the company? And that's a really important difference. There's no such thing as a great Silicon Valley technology company that has guys in the basement taking orders from the guys who are not as good as them. That's just not how it works. So I think that, to me, that's a really important difference.
Yeah. So what values are important for starting a defense startup?
You know, the values is you need to be patriots, you need to be aligned. I do not believe you can have Democrats, you can have Republicans, you can have people with different political views, but you need to have a shared values of believing that you want America to be strong and you're loyal to the country. So first of all, to me, that's really important. I don't think you can have that otherwise. I think on top of that, to me, to have the very best defense startups, you need to be doing it for the right non-crony reasons. A lot of defense companies are really happy if they can use some unfair advantage to close contracts and make money, whether or not they're bringing the very best. So you see a lot of stuff, we call them the Beltway bandits. You see a lot of stuff around the Beltway where they used to work in the Army, they used to work in defense, and they have friends, and they'll do whatever they can to get a contract, and this is how they're gonna make a living, and they're just really proud of their connections to get contracts. Like a lot of these startups, instead of pitching you about why this is the best thing substantively, they'll spend a lot of time pitching you about all their special connections in defense. And to me, frankly, I think that's disgusting. I think the way America is going to be stronger is this is better talent. These are better solutions. It's not because we have better connections. That the connections part is tertiary, and you should be able to figure out the connections if you have the best of the first two.
So switching to your experience with Palantir, what headwinds did Palantir have in Washington, D.C. in the early years with selling to the government?
Sure. Well, in Palantir, we were always outsiders. So we were ranked #1 in Silicon Valley for tech culture for quite a while. Our biggest competitor was Facebook in terms of hiring. We had solutions that being someone like Unisys would get paid $3 billion after going over budget to do something for DHS that we knew we could do out of the box. And so obviously these insiders were very, very threatened by us, and everyone wanted to do anything they can to keep you out. What tends to happen is even if you're substantively creating most of the value, the insiders, because they have the connections, because they own various contracts, the way they see things is that 99% of the value should be for them, and you should partner with them, and they can pat you on the head like a little kid, and they should take all the upside. And that's basically how it works. And you see this protectionism there across the board. It's very, very hard to break in. It's very, very hard, even when you've already proven yourself, to kind of get these big contracts. With the Army, we were working with special forces at first because special forces have lives on the line. They have some problems they need to solve today, and you tend to see a lot of real competence from the special forces groups where they'll kind of just break the rules just to take whatever's best and do it, and then to break through the bureaucracy. So we work with special forces, and then the Army, people started seeing, wow, there's way less IED deaths with these special forces groups, as in one example. Can we use the same thing? And they couldn't get the contract, but we gave it to them because it was saving lives. And so we started seeing a lot of them use it, and there was a competitive product that these generals had spent billions of dollars on that didn't work as well. And it became documented how they were just absolutely outperforming the competitive product, and people were just actively trying to use it to save lives. And the Army heard they were using it without going through the proper channels, totally shut it down, and ordered them to destroy the records of the lives saved. And then when it came up for a big bid for the D6 thing, they basically just like gave it to their friends again. And we actually had to sue them for destroying records. We won the lawsuit. We ended up winning the thing. But it's like there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of people who just don't want to work with outsiders because they're very threatened by things if it's not coming from them.
Yeah, and I've seen that myself. And there's especially in the DC area, right? There's a lot of it's a lot of relationships and who knows who, and it's kind of a bureaucratic game. But are there any advice for a startup that's trying to break into that space? How do you make those early connections to help you play that game and get into it? Because
you got to find the competent people in any government department, no matter how frustrating it is. There's going to be some bureaucrats who are incompetent, and there's going to be some good people who are patriotic, who are competent. And you got to build allies, and you got to iterate really quickly with them. And people become allies when they're impressed by the fact that you're listening to them and you're iterating quickly. So I was, JetBlue didn't used to have a first class or business class section, and I was on JetBlue 2 or 3 times a month for the first couple of years. We were building this, going back and forth, meeting people, getting their advice, getting their input, and we'd blow them away. We'd come back 2 weeks later, and they'd say, wow, I thought that would take you a year. I didn't think you listened to me. We'd have everything they asked for, and then they'd say, okay, well, actually, we need these things as well. And then they try it, and we would keep iterating. And if you could do, the difference between a really great technology culture and an average one is a great one can iterate at 20 times the speed. So if you can iterate really quickly, it's all of a sudden in 6 months, you have everything possibly they wanted and could have asked for. And they feel really listened to, they feel honored, it's useful to them. And suddenly you're in. I mean, I think in order to be in as an outsider, you have to be 10 times as good as what's there. But the secret lesson is it's not that hard to be 10 times as good as what's there. There are not really top people iterating really quickly with these people most of the time.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Might just throw them in right now. So one's from Joshua Bear. Why are some traditional investors afraid of investing in startups who work with the defense industry?
Well, it's really hard to know from the outside what is like real repeatable revenue and what's not. So it's obviously, so I'm involved in a couple of new companies, Anduril and Epirus, and Anduril just got like the fastest ever to a system of record. That's very, very rare. So it's what's very common is a startup will get granted a $500,000 pilot, a $250,000 pilot, maybe $1 million or $2 million here and there, and then they'll just never get the system of record because they don't have the right connections, because there's all these programs that help new companies. But the jump from being a new company to being big, the big guys will close ranks, they'll do whatever they can to stop you and to try to kill you. So it's just very, very hard to break from being like I'm working with some special program with Army Futures to actually being treated seriously and actually taking it to the next level. And so that's why I think a lot of people don't have those connections. They have to really have those connections to understand it. So it's just very nerve-wracking to write these checks. And I think on the defense side, you really have to have like just something that's just really, really strong to break through that kind of glass ceiling. And it's not easy.
Yeah, another question from Paul Norwood. Should the flow of foreign funding cause concerns within the startup community? Does accepting foreign money cause concerns to DoD?
It depends what the foreign money is. If it's a Chinese entity, that's actually very scary. Obviously, North Korean, Russian, Iranian, etc. There's certain ones you probably don't want to take their money. If it's like some money from an allied country, if it's money from like people in London, if it's even money from the UAE, and it's a minority investor, and you make sure they don't have a certain rights, I think that's totally fine. I think it's totally fine to work with these people. Back when I was running Palantir, we decided to keep it less than 5% for foreigners, at least back when I was there. I think it may be less than 10% now, but it's like no one who has actual control of the company. It's really important they don't control the company. And I think it's okay to work with allied countries. Sometimes your best early customers might be in the Middle East or might be in Western or Northern Europe.
We have another one from Paul, I believe. Do you think the dual use pitch makes sense for investors? Do you think it makes sense for startups to have dual tracks, or should they focus on one or the other?
That's a really good question. I tend to think that the first few years of a company, if you're not really focused on one thing, you're not going to make it work. Even Palantir was like only on government for the first few years, and I started the kind of financial commercial division maybe years 3 or 4. And if we had to do it again, I might have even started that a little bit later. It's really hard to do 2 things at once early on. It takes just if you have to be 10x better and iterating faster, you can't do that in multiple areas unless you have just an insane amount of resources. So in general, I'd focus. Just the example with Epirus I'll give you is we have what we now believe is the world's most advanced EMP system. It turns out a lot of people who own stadiums are very interested in being able to defend against drone attacks. It's like a thing that's evolving. So there's stadiums who are doing pilots with us and just learning about it, and like that's kind of cool. So there's kind of a commercial use, but and there's also like a power chip we have that AMD is looking into based on that we had to build for it. So there's some kind of things where we're exploring commercial uses, but for me, the bulk of the company should be focused on defense for now.
We have another one. I'll keep going with the questions in the private chat, or the live comments, sorry. This one's from Ken Phillips. So what about partnering with established defense contractors to get into the game? Palantir took a hard stance against working with others. Does that mean all startups should go it alone or take the government to court in order to deliver the capability?
I think it depends on what kind of partners you have there. Both Anduril and Epirus are partnering a little bit more than Palantir and are working with others where there's advantages on both sides. And if you can get the respect of these other companies where they're going to treat you like a senior company, then I think it's very worthwhile exploring. The landscape might have shifted slightly. If you go back to the landscape when Palantir was starting out, I mentioned this earlier, the attitude was we create all the value, you're a little kid, and we're going to give you maybe 1 or 2 or 3% of this value, and you should be very grateful for that. And that's how our partnership's going to work. And obviously, if that's the situation, then you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. At the same time, if you can get people to respect you, to work well with you, if they can acknowledge the value startups are creating, which then I think it's fine to partner. I do see some of the primes opening up a little bit. Even obviously Deloitte and others as well starting to realize there's value in like partnering on both sides can create value. And if you get that kind of positive attitude, then I think it's a worthwhile thing to explore.
Going back to the dual use topic, working in both a company that does something in both defense and industry, commercial use. Are there any advantages to thinking about that in the context of access to data? Because that's one of the challenges in startup space, especially if you're doing work in the defense world, is getting access to data, and sometimes that data might be classified at various levels. What are the challenges that you've experienced in that space, and you have any insights on how a startup might deal with that?
Yeah, in the cyber space, there's certain types of data that comes from the NSA that they have that others don't, and it comes from the Israeli intelligence group. I have seen a couple companies kind of partner in government for threat detection and anomaly detection, and there's things you could do you couldn't do otherwise if you weren't working with the government. So I think that data is very interesting. In general, for most of these other areas, I honestly think there really are separate businesses. And as much as there's definitely, if you have a mission-driven company where you attract the best people into this mission-driven thing in defense, and then you sometimes can make breakthroughs that then apply to other areas. And again, as something like that's what I think Everest has done. There's some really big power chip breakthroughs they've made thanks to the EMP systems they're working on, which they may now apply to other areas. And so sometimes you can get 20 or 30 of the best people in the world in an area working hard for a couple of years, which leads to that. But otherwise, I really think you should treat them as separate businesses.
We have a lot of good activity on the live comments section here, so I'm going to keep going with that. We have a question from Kevin Lantry. What's the perspective from the Silicon Valley VC community about the DoD's Trusted Capital Initiative?
What's the DoD's Trusted Capital Initiative?
Yeah.
I know a little bit about that my friends told me, but unfortunately, it hasn't. Just from my perspective, it's not something that I fully understand. I'll be totally honest. So I'm not an expert on that one.
And a follow up from Kevin, just to throw it in there. What's the most exciting new product or technology you've seen recently?
Gosh, I've been mentioning it, but I have to say it's just the fact that these directed EMP systems can take out electronics with 300 meters accurately. I just think it's really fun. We're using it for naval purposes. We're using it for drones. We're using it for it's the kind of thing you can carry in a SEAL team. And before you hit an installation, you just wipe out all the electronics. I think this kind of stuff's really fun. And so to me, that's a really exciting one right now.
Well, let's go back to our narrative here. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of engineering culture and leadership culture, right? So what insights are important for building a world-class engineering culture from scratch in a startup?
From scratch in a startup, the number one thing with these things early on is you want people who are owners of the company. So you want to basically get people who are very talented, or other people respect and want to work for, and you actually want a culture where there's people who are really similar to each other in some ways, in the sense that they understand each other, they like spending time together, they have somehow cultural things in common, and you want to get a bunch of those people, and you just get them obsessed, and it's just build for a couple of years. And as much as possible, you want only the build side of the company the first few years. The biggest mistake people make is they hire what I call adults early on, and there's adults that are the best salespeople in the world. There's adults that know how to run different processes of big companies. You don't want those adults around the first few years. You want people who know how to build around the first few years, who know how to iterate. And listen, sometimes the best iterators could be in their 50s or 60s because they're innovative, but they're the kind of innovative mindset where there's not a right way of doing things. They're just people who explore, who go fast, who try stuff. And so what you want early on is a culture of all builders. And only once you have things start to work, then you bring in the adults who know how to sell, who know how to do DevOps, who know how to do whatever the other types of things that you need to know how to do, who know how to do customer service, et cetera. If you have those adults too early, they tend to break the build cultures.
And I always think that I like to see a little bit of naive in the culture too, right? The idea that somebody's coming in from the outside and doesn't have a completely shaped perspective yet.
100%. You want outsiders. You don't want a bunch of generals. Like if someone's like, I'm starting a defense company and I have all these 4-star generals running it in it's month 1, and I said, well, actually, that's a really good way to fail. That's how you're going to have a failed innovative culture, because you have people who have already been there their whole life, who already have all the wrong assumptions about what the world's going to look like in 10 or 20 years from now. Now, that said, you might want those generals as advisors, but you don't want them there every day bugging the build innovators. You just don't. You want outsiders. You want people who are innovative.
Yeah, and actually tying that, we have a question that's related to this. So Stephen Reich has asked, you're trying to meet the right contacts in the DoD for our innovative technology, and we have success with grants from challenges in the Air Force, DHS, and Customs and Border Patrol. We're reactive, but we want to be connected so we can be proactive. Do you believe that lobbyists and defense consultants are critical for startups like ours?
You know what we've always done I've only done this a few times, but what we've done is we try to get some really top people. Ideally, the people we're attracting are already top. Kind of usually there's some billionaires in DC, in Europe, some people who are top generals, whatever they are, and they're impressed by what you're doing, and then they make introductions for you. So I think how you're introduced to people really matters. Being introduced by like a typical lobbyist versus being introduced by George Tenet or by someone who's prominent, it's very different. So the question is, you have to really impress top people, and then you have to really impress top people, and you have to go in that way. I think ultimately you're going to want to use lobbyists, but it's not a good way to start. You have to find some other way to get to the top people and impress them.
So what is your, we talked a little bit about this earlier as well. What's your view on the China situation over the next 2 decades? The situation is going to evolve with China in what way? Which part of it? Just in the terms of the geopolitics and how the startup industry in China is growing, and how will that work in terms of the United States interaction with China?
I would like to say that there could be some really positive ways we could find to make this so there's not a confrontation. It doesn't seem very likely. I think China is basically on a direct collision course, and they will do everything they can to steal everything we're doing and to make sure that they try to get ahead of us. And it's very scary right now, because in China, the best and the brightest go into defense. So I map out for a living like where the top technology talent goes. We have one of the top couple multi-billion-dollar venture funds, is what a few of us do out here, and very few of the very top technology talent, technologists have gone into the defense world over the last 20 years. In China, they forced the very top to go into the defense world, and so China has been innovating and gaining on us. And there's a complacency in America. One of the last institutions we respect is defense, and because we respect the institution, I think we're very naive about how much we've fallen behind and how much decay there is in terms of how we spend money. Most of the money we spend in American defense is a jobs program. It's not an innovation program, and most of it is what we like to call innovation theater. There's lots of innovation theater going on in America. There's lots of jobs programs. There's very little cutting edge defense work going on. And so I'm very, very worried China gets ahead. If they get ahead enough that they're confident that they're ahead, then they start to do things around Taiwan. They start to do things around other parts of the world that are terrifying. And so I think the only way we have peace and the only way we deter China is to completely revamp and take a lot of this money that's going into innovation theater from legacy, frankly, pathetic companies, and put it into top talent and startups, and actually fix how our defense world works. This is the best hope for peace.
Yeah, and the ecosystem works a little differently in China too, right? So it's a national strategic imperative, and they, as you said, force folks into it.
You are now going into the defense world, yes.
Yeah, and whereas in the United States we have freedom, and we have to.
And I definitely support that freedom, and people have a freedom to have the opinions they want. I happen to disagree with these people these companies that don't want to work in defense. I think it's a huge mistake for the world.
So it's an additional challenge for us to convince folks. It's the strategic imperative for us. Is to
hopefully we can inspire them. Hopefully we can have leadership that's able to inspire people. I mean, part of America inspiring the best and brightest is to have leadership that inspires the best and brightest. That's all of our jobs, to fix that and to get that in the right shape.
So going forward with the China question, another follow on there. What are your insights on that seemingly inherent tension between data privacy and data science, right? So China is aggregating large amounts of data and doing what they do with that.
Yeah, no, we need to be I mean, I'm a civil libertarian, and I don't like the fact that if someone can access our systems, they can track us. One of the most ironic things about Palantir is people like, oh, you built a giant data tracking company. And if you actually look at Palantir, like, we were the first to hire civil libertarians in like the 2000s, and to map out what we did is we created a giant privacy engine, and we created a system that where you can always watch the watchers. You could be exactly sure how people are using data. So ironically, after creating like the world's most advanced privacy engine that lets us do all these things legally, you know, because it's then being used by government, you're accused of being on the opposite side of the issue, which is kind of silly. What I would say, however, is we are way too obsessed with bad privacy regulations. So healthcare is an analogous example. Like, there's lots of people dying of cancer today who should not be dying of cancer because we're not able to get all the data in one place and say, okay, if you have this type of cancer, here's this, you have this type of response that works. Because of really dumb HIPAA legislation, it's basically impossible to do the aggregate data analysis. And so you literally have people dying today. So you go ahead and preach to me all you want about the dangers of these systems. You are killing people because we cannot get the freaking data to do it. And so you know, and I think that's a much bigger issue than terrorism for America. I think terrorism's an issue too. I think people dying of cancer is a bigger issue. So I mean, obviously you want to be able to get the data together. You want to have really clear rules about how it's used, but you want to be able to get it all together. And so to me, the fact that we're prevented from even aggregating it is absolutely ridiculous due to just incompetence and bad laws.
And what advice do you have to any startup that's trying to work through it? Because you mentioned HIPAA and there's a GDPR. There's all these different regulations.
You know, you got to be aggressive, and you got to create incentives. The hardest thing for startups is not what you would do if you could get all the data together. Like, any one of us could figure out. We could sit down in a room with 3 bright people, and we could build the system that would get all the data, and it would tell us which cancer treatments to work and how to iterate over time if we had all the data in one place, right? So that the problem is not hard if the data is there. The problem is, how do you create the incentives to get the data there? So Palantir, this is actually a pretty good insight on Palantir and how it was designed. Everyone in the government always fantasizes about a hub and spoke. So every new government department, whether it's a central intelligence agency, whether it's Director of National Intelligence, whether it's a national counterterrorism center, they all imagine themselves as creating this new hub that everything's going to work with. And that's a fantasy, right? You're never going to have a hub and spoke. You're always going to have a distributed system where there's competing actors, where they each have their own hubs of influence, they each have their own data, and they have connections between them. So when we designed Palantir, we said, okay, obviously we'd love to have a hub and spoke model. It's never going to be that way. And so we're going to have different installations, different parts of the FBI, different parts of the CIA, different parts of MI5 and MI6 in Britain, different parts of the National Counterterrorism Center, different parts of the DIA, and you know you're going to be installing these all separately. However, you're going to design it so you can flip a switch, and you can have the ontologies be normalized to talk to each other. And so Palantir was designed out of the box, assuming it would be deployed distributed systems, and then would be able to, we call them next side, they'd be able to turn on and talk to each other. And so that was kind of the elegant thing we did there, is we created the incentives to make it very easy for one group to talk to another group with specific rules. And then at some point they all got turned on. So now you have 35 countries, and they're all sharing data based on each of their own separate rules with each other. And so I think when you design these things, you have to be realistic out of the box and realize you're dealing in a distributed world, and then enable them to be more centralized in how they work, and enable the incentives to be there. So it's very easy for each little piece of the path to work until you get to the end path you're going for.
We have a couple more questions from the audience here. Paul Millar is asking, what type of challenges do you see with the scalability of the business segment of defense?
You know, defense is a really big area. If you solve an important problem, you're gonna be able to make a lot of money. So I think defense is a thing. It's very, very scalable. I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at, but it's a big TAM, and you know, if you build a good company, you can build a large company there.
Yeah, and you know, in a lot of ways, you can take a few more risks, a little bit more risk in the defense sector, right? If you access funding from the right customers, they might support you through a especially risky part of your business development plan. So there's an opportunity there as well. Paul Norwood has another question. The DoD and other national security organizations have innovation units and are expanding downward from the operational to tactical level. Any advice on working with these organizations? How can they improve adoption?
That's a great question. You know, I'll be honest. I've gotten back into this business in the last 3 or 4 years, and so I have worked with some of these groups, but I have people who work for me and with me who probably know in a lot more detail. My my main advice is that the way you get to break in and get people working with you is you're solving a problem that is a problem today, where there's either lives on the line or some really hard thing they're working on. These tactical groups for me are oftentimes the very best groups to work with because they actually have something they need solved today. And when in my experience, it doesn't really matter what you charge them. You need to get in the door. You just need to solve their problems, impress them, and build relationships. And then oftentimes they've been very helpful at then kind of helping us win bigger contracts later on. So as much as it's just like any other corporation where there's good people, you find good people, you solve their problems, and then they'll help you kind of get into larger work.
Another question from JD Stanley. What is your view on blending defense coders doing their own AI ML code versus commercial coding? Ideas on how to best ensure national security blending in a co-coding model of defense and startups?
You know, I tend to think that the most advanced AI and ML is going on outside of the defense world at this point anyway. Other than maybe some very specific cyber things happening at the NSA, in general, I'm not too worried about that, just because if China wanted to spy and like get the very best AI, for example, to use in their defense, they probably wouldn't be spying on Langley or NDC. They'd probably be spying on like Google or Facebook or one of these other places, right? So in general, I think it's, I don't think it's as big of a risk, especially the way things work right now.
You know, another important player in the AI space is academia. So do you have any insights on how a startup might partner not only but academia as well?
Of course, and I was chatting last year with the Dean of Engineering at Stanford, and she's a very bright woman who's also very concerned about what's going on with China, but doesn't really have any answers to it, because everything they make, the whole culture there is their currency of the realm is publishing papers and publishing what they're doing. And so, but what you actually see, China's been winning most of the AI contests lately, but what they do is they take the papers that are most advanced, published in the West, and then they tweak them really well, and they iterate on them really well, and then they'll take solutions they didn't come up with, but then they worked on really hard with a bunch of smart people, and then they'll usually kind of win these competitions. But yeah, obviously, if you want to be in the advanced part of the AI world, whether you're China or whether you're someone in America, you should be following the best people out of the top 10 or 15 schools here. That's where a lot of it's happening.
Chris Leonard has another question. I think this is the first question. What if we are a small startup? If we are a small startup, very much in the build only, no adults stage, how do we best find folks willing to start exploring the application of our technology to defense related challenges?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't. Yeah, first of all, you should either be building for defense or not. I don't think it's possible when you're in that early innovation stage to just be like kind of building something that maybe is useful for defense, maybe just for something else. That's very much how things tended to work. If you look at like the MIT ecosystem's really gone downhill versus Silicon Valley, it's like 100x or something in the last 15 years. And the reason it's such a big disparity is that you see a lot of the culture around the Boston ecosystem. I mean, there's exceptions obviously, but a lot of culture is, here's a really cool breakthrough, a really cool technology is like a special magical box that does X, Y, and Z, and we're going to explore what businesses we're going to build around it. And that's like one approach to building a business. And then the other approach to building a business, which I associate more with Silicon Valley, is this is a really big problem in the world. This process needs to be fixed. We're going to build technology to solve this problem and solve this process, right? So it's two different approaches. If your approach is we have a really cool technology and we're going to figure out if we can apply it or not, I think that's just not even a good way to build a business. You need to stop right now and you just say, okay, here's the problem all of us are going to try to solve, and it's a very specific problem, and we're going to work to fix that process, and then we're going to build technology around fixing that process and around getting people who own that process to notice us and work with us and kind of hack our way into it by providing value to them. That's the Silicon Valley way to build things, and that's the only way I've seen that really, really works. So you can just choose one thing you're working on and really, really drive towards it. And if you're doing that, then you're going to be able to build all sorts of things around it for them. And you're going to be able to understand what they're doing, and you're just going to have to just keep talking and iterating, getting feedback until you've solved that problem for them.
Have you seen, within your venture capital business, any opportunities where one startup is working in the commercial space, another is working in the military space, and they can actually work together? I mean, so partnering startups together through venture capital?
It's really, really hard for startups to partner effectively with other startups. I've not seen that work historically. I think a startup, if it works really hard and it's really specific, there could be a way they could partner with a much larger company. And so sometimes you'll have a partnership where a startup plus a big company, if the big company again comes to it with the right mindset and the right incentives and has a reason why to treat you like your senior, that could work. I think it's just generally a mistake for two startups to partner. I think it just almost never works. And if it's such a good idea, they should just merge and be the same company. That's what I would say.
So, Paul Norwood, how can larger companies make working with them a better experience for startups? What's the pain point that needs removal?
For the big companies?
For the big companies, yeah. If a startup wants to work with a big company, what's the number one challenge for them in doing so?
That's a great question. So I think big companies, first of all, should only work with startups when the startup's doing something they're convinced they can't do themselves. If they think they can do it themselves anyway, this is just going to end in disaster because they're not going to really value it very highly. So it has to be something that's like actually important and valuable to the big company, and they're actually convinced they can't do it themselves. And then at that point, if it's that worth it, then you need like a new group to work with them. And I think this actually gets back to the question in general of how big companies can do important new things. Like one of the rules Steve Jobs had is that if you're going to create something new, you isolate it from most of your company, and you only have like maybe one or two at most touch points to the whole company. So what happens if you have a new thing and you have like 10 executives or 15 people who are all kind of interacting with it? They're almost always going to break it. The analogy he used is like, if you have like 15 people try to design a horse, you're always going to get a camel. And so basically you have to be able to protect it from your executives. You have to be able to have a mandate from one or two very senior decision makers who are interacting with it. And you basically need to define the interface, define the goals, and just be really clear up front about what the goals are, what's each side's incentive, and how's it going to work. And but what I've always seen with new things big companies do is it just gets to be a mess because just everyone has their hand in it, and the more it succeeds, the more everyone else wants to have an opinion on it, wants to be threatened by it, wants to mess it around. So as much as you can have a very strong leader who owns the decision-making process and who protects it and defines the interface very well, the more likely it's going to work. Is my experience.
So we have another question here. So I think this is going back to the values part of doing defense startups. What values are the most important in starting a defense startup? What would you prioritize as the most important value for any founder?
Well, I mean, I think in general for building a top technology culture is you want to have a technology culture that's run by technologists, that's attracting the very best technologists, where the talent are owners, and where they're passionate about the mission. So if you have top technologists who are owners and are passionate about the mission, then there's lots of other things that kind of work out from there. If you don't have that as a starting point, if you don't have the majority of your company owned by the build side, if you're not doing whatever you can to attract and build a very top technology culture, and you don't have a mission-driven culture where these people really care about the mission, then it's going to be pretty tough.
So let's talk a little bit about access to data, because if you're really trying to experiment with mission data or innovate new approaches in data science or AI for applied to mission data, getting access to that mission data can be a challenge. So what's a good strategy? What are some good strategies that your startups have employed in the past to break through those restrictions so that you can actually innovate and experiment on these algorithms, on these techniques?
I think for a lot of the things that we're working on right now, we just started by creating our own data and then getting feedback from people and iterating on it. And then, eventually, I think you break in eventually when you get pilots and when you really impress people with what you're doing. But at least for all the things I've worked on, I've been able to create data and just create maps of it and then ask people, and they can say, oh, that's really clever, that's really cool what you're doing, but our data would have this, this, and this. And then you kind of can iterate and you kind of can learn. And I agree it's not perfect, but it's like for any type of AI challenge with a drone or with anything else, and you create the data yourself, right? And so now that said, there are certain types of data. I know Palantir's worked on there was like an AI thing they were working on where they're looking at like the defense ground control force mapping of our more near adversaries as opposed to asymmetric adversaries. And so you try to map out their forces and you try to like do pattern matching and predict things. And that's really hard data to get otherwise. And so I guess I would argue there's a certain set of challenges you're probably not going to be able to work on as a startup as easily without having really the right relationships. And that's just the way it is. I do think it'd be nice if the Army if the DoD figured out more ways of opening that up to people. I'm not an expert on what they're opening up and not to startups there, but I think it's a good question for us to be working on.
Yeah. And so what factors are important for incubation, companies that at that incubation stage, both in terms of funding and also access to data?
Sure. Well, I think incubation in general, I generally think it's not a good idea to try to start a lot of things at once. A lot of people who want to get involved in entrepreneurship like incubation because it's kind of like the safer way of doing things rather than having courage in building this company. You can build lots of companies and that way it's safer. I think in general you want to do one of these at a time, at least when you're starting, and don't try to start multiple at once. Because the word incubation always triggers me in that regard. I also think it's just really important to have, when you're building these things, you want like really good full-time leaders. If you have, like, one of my rules is I'm only responsible for the failure of one thing at a time. Like, I can't be a leader of lots of things I'm building. You need people who are full-time founders who own a big piece of it, who are running it, and they're the ones responsible. They're waking up, going to sleep, thinking about it. So I think the rule for incubation is make sure it's like there are lots of really good full-time people just focus on this. Instead of doing 3 things, do your best idea. Just incubate one, and then it goes back to the other stuff we were talking about with tech culture's mission.
You know, in the DC area, there's a lot of defense startups, of course, and proximity is a big benefit, right? The fact that you're just close to all of these different agencies, the customer, the center of funding, but also the folks that start these companies oftentimes have past experience in defense work or within the community here. How important is that for somebody? How much of a benefit is that really in terms of an advantage versus somebody that might be in that doesn't have that kind of background and has a defense idea and wants to push it forward? You know,
there's certain ideas that are only going to be had most likely by people who are experiencing this, right? So you're going to have certain ideas only had by people who know what's going on. Obviously, my colleagues and I did not really have any background in the intelligence world when starting Palantir, and so I think if you come at it with maybe a little bit of overconfidence, but you're willing to iterate and learn, I think the outsider mentality is how you're going to get the really big companies built. So I wouldn't be surprised that the biggest companies are built by outsiders, but then more companies, including a lot of small useful things, are built by insiders. That would be the framework I would think about.
And if somebody has an idea, a great idea for the defense solution, what's your advice for them to get?
Well, just talk to as many people as possible. This is always the mistake you'll make with new ideas. You should imagine there's hundreds of millions of people in the world. There's millions of people thinking about ideas for different things. Imagine there's like 5 other people who came up with your idea, and so of the 5 of you, one of you goes and talks to 100 people and gets feedback and learns, iterates, and the other 4 are really careful and make sure no one steals their idea. Like, which of the 5 do you think is going to be more successful? Right? It's pretty obvious, right? So I think there's this instinct to protect and not let the idea get stolen, and to be really careful about it. And I just, people are really busy. They're not all out to steal your idea. You probably, if you go talk to lots of people, and then because at the end of the day, execution is what's really valuable anyway. And your idea is going to get a lot better having talked to a lot of people, having gotten feedback on it. And you'll probably end up finding and inspiring people to work with you on it too, who are going to make it more likely to work. So the key thing is just like, even if you're an outsider, you've got to spend tons of time talking to people and learning. Otherwise, you're not gonna make it work.
What's your perspective on folks that are that have a current job, that they're currently employed and have an idea that they're passionate about and want to potentially do something in a startup part time? How has that? What insights do you have from any experience in that area?
It's really hard to do these things part-time. They really are full-time jobs. I think while you're employed, you can go talk to people and get feedback, and you could go try to meet people who run funds, meet people who run these companies, get their advice. I think it's totally fine to spend time getting their advice and learning. You have to get to a decision point where you should have to jump in or not. And it's one of those things. It's hard, but I don't think these things can be done well part-time.
We have a question from the audience. So in scanning the market of startups and considering passion for defense, where is the biggest gap in technology you've seen in the last 6 months? Whether it's not hitting the mark or the tech is not mature enough?
One of the frames I'm thinking of right now, we do this a lot in other industries, is the open platform versus closed platform frame. So if you open things up in the right way, there's lots of competition, and they iterate and they get better. And so the first banks to open in certain areas, suddenly people all build on top of them, and they can build on top of them much better solutions than any one bank could have built itself. And there's always versions of that. In the defense world, this applies, as far as I'm concerned, to quite a few areas. I'll give you one area right now I'm exploring myself, would love people to help, is we're trying to map out a lot of top robotics talent. I tend to think that we can make a game where, I don't know if you ever read Ender's Game, where like they compete in the Orson Scott Card thing. But I think we can create a game. You get a bunch of land, you create, you have to be specific. Here's the rules for how the robots work. Here's the rules for what people can do. And here's the rules for the interface for people, who are online. So you'd have like 3 parts: the interface online, the people on the ground, the robots on the ground, and people designing strategies for each. And they'd have these little, fake robot wars, basically, be a competition. And there'd be different ways they'd fight each other with lasers, obviously not killing anybody, but just for practice. And I bet you, if you open that up in the right way, and you brought in a lot of young talent and other talent to try things you get way better interfaces in the background. You get way better ways people can work with robots in a battle situation. I'm convinced it'd get way ahead of anything that DoD is doing right now if you opened it up. So that could be a really fun thing to open up in the right way. So I think that it could be a consumer company and a DoD company. So there's an interesting question of like what are the types of examples where you can open up platforms and you can let innovation accelerate way beyond what we have right now. And so that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah, and the other aspect of that is also opportunity to censor up the environment and observe real people make real decisions under real game theoretic situations.
Exactly.
And then to learn from that.
Plus, it'd be a fun game to
yeah, exactly. So that's the concept of a data platform. Just being able to gather that data and enabling rapid experimentation on different aspects of it that's a great concept. So we're down to the last 2 minutes. Are there any final questions for our esteemed colleague here? Tony White has one question. How are foreign countries like the UK seen in terms of leading tech and innovation? Do you see UK startups making a difference?
So London is a very exciting ecosystem. I'm very bullish on the UK right now. We've seen a lot of things both in the bio world and as well as obviously DeepMind and others coming out of the UK. So you got some real top talent there. I personally haven't seen a lot of defense companies there. I've heard of a few, but I'm unfortunately right now I'm not able to travel over there, as planning on doing a lot more there this year. I'm very bullish on the UK. I would expect to see some stuff coming out of Cambridge and London that's quite strong here. So I'm excited to do more there for sure.
Well, that's the last question. Thank you. So Joe, thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Very insightful conversation. Looking forward to the rest of the conference. This is an unprecedented thing, a virtual conference, but it's going really well. So thanks for your time.
Awesome. Good luck. Take care.